From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. I'm Kim Strassel here with Colin Levy and Alicia Finley. Senate Republicans on Thursday blocked a bill sponsored by Rhode Island Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, which they claimed was aimed at dragging dark money into the sunlight. Let's listen to Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer on the bill.
By giving massive corporations the same rights as individual citizens, multi-billionaires being able to have their voice shouted out, drowning out the views of citizens, and by casting aside decades of campaign finance law, and by paving the way for powerful elites to anonymously pump endless cash into elections, Citizens United has disfigured our democracy almost beyond recognition.
This is an issue that just drives me around the bend, I gotta be honest. Every single election cycle, Democrats bring up one of these bills, and they always claim that, shadowy elites are pumping money into the campaign finance system and that they're going to save democracy. By the way, I would just point out, if you want to look where all the shadowy money is right now, it's all on the Democratic side. Just ask any Republican running for election. But the bigger problem is when you look at these bills and you drill down, they're almost always about squelching their opponent's political speech. Because, disclosure sounds good, transparency sounds good, but politicians are never motivated by the public good. They just want to win. So wrapped in all of these bills are usually provisions designed to make sure that their opponents are disadvantaged. Colin, you've looked through this bill. What's really in it? Tell me if I'm wrong. What's the real game here?
Yeah, no, 100%. I mean, look, one of the really clear things here is what's included is now they're going after any ads that are mentioning judicial candidates. That's something new that hasn't been included in the Disclose Act before, although they've tried to roll that out in other bills. That happened because why? Because they didn't like that groups were running ads supporting Trump's judicial nominees. So they decided that now they would just roll that into it, even though obviously a judicial nominee is not a candidate. They wouldn't sort of qualify under any of the other campaign laws that we look at. And look, this bill is in so many ways a very sneaky thing because the way we have the law right now, if you are a group and you want to run an ad within 30 days of a primary or 60 days of a general election, then you have to disclose who's donating to that. But this kind of Disclose Act would basically make that into a 365-day-a-year provision because any group that mentions a candidate, even, call Chuck Schumer and tell him you think he's great, now sort of qualifies for that kind of disclosure. And a second point that I think is important to mention here in terms of the way they want to target their political opponents is that a bill like this, which says that anyone who contributes more than $10,000 in a 2-year cycle to a group would be disclosed, is very easily targeted at business groups. A lot of these business groups, you think of big groups, the National Association of Manufacturers, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. These groups have members who, just as a matter of dues, put that much money in. So if those groups mention a candidate, whether or not those dues were in any way intended to be for that specifically, you have a whole huge list of donors that get exposed. So there's a lot of convenience there for the Democrats, for sure.
Yeah, it strikes me that one important aspect of this bill, by contrast to a lot of our campaign finance bills, is it's not so much about limiting who can spend or where they can spend it or timeframes. This is about outing people who give money. And that raises the real threat of intimidation. You go all the way back to 1958, and the Supreme Court decided this really important case, NAACP versus Alabama. It was a Jim Crow South, and Alabama's Attorney General wanted the NAACP to turn over a list of its membership, which could have been very deadly for those members at that period of time. And the decision was a landmark, and that it said that implicit in the First Amendment is a freedom of association, and that government snooping on groups could really chill that First Amendment right. And the court has kind of abandoned that decision a bit in the wake of the craze post-Watergate for all these disclosure laws. It hasn't overturned it. It's just kind of cast it to one side. And yet now we have this new rush for disclosure. Alicia, especially given how much more intimidation we are seeing in today's political environment, doesn't this act actually raise some real threats to liberty and freedom of association? And even if it passed, would it even maybe potentially be constitutionally sound?
To your point, I think it would be struck down. The Supreme Court, assuming it got there, would strike it down. We had this other case, the Americans for Prosperity v. Bond, which was decided last year, which involved a California Attorney's General mandate that 501c3s, which are charities, would be required to disclose their donors to the AG's office. And now the charities led by Americans for Prosperity sued and argued that this would infringe on their association rights and cited the NAACP v. Alabama because donors would be afraid to give to their groups if they thought that the AG could leak this information. And in fact, we've seen that happen in New York recently, leaking the tax filings of the Nikki Haley's nonprofit. And so the Supreme Court ruled in favor of Americans for Prosperity and said that these disclosure requirements to the AG were infringed on their First Amendment rights. And I think that you would see, if this Disclose Act passed, I think you would probably see the Supreme Court apply that decision and maybe even broaden it further. So this is one of those cases where I'm not sure Democrats even want this bill to pass, because you could really see the Supreme Court coming in and smacking the Democrats down and perhaps issuing a very much more broad and sweeping rule against disclosure requirements.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up that AFP lawsuit, because that was, in fact, a good return by the Supreme Court to this association issue and a reaffirmation of it, although in my mind it still hasn't gone far enough to reconcile some of its past decisions on campaign finance laws and disclosure with that NAACP opinion and the one from last year. Colin, one more aspect of this before we turn to letters, but the left used to be the party of civil rights and free speech. In recent decades, it just seems to have abandoned so many of those principles in favor of speech controls and using the system to get political advantage. I did notice, however, that there were some pretty prominent liberal groups that were opposing this act, including the ACLU and the NAACP. Do you think there's maybe a little bit of a growing recognition among some of these groups that these laws could boomerang on them too?
Yeah, I think that's right for sure. Anyone honest on either side of the political aisle has to look at these and realize that it's going to hit everyone, right? And, liberal groups do this kind of work too, and they may want some privacy for their donors as well. Look, you mentioned the NAACP case, and it's really important because that case reminds us that, the restraint on freedom of association is particularly relevant when people are speaking out on politically marginal or contested issues. And people who are most vulnerable can find themselves exposed. And obviously, they can get dragged through social media, as we've seen happen, as a lot of groups have targeted people's views and embarrassed them that way. But it can also happen, really importantly, something I think we should talk about is with, let's say, it's a group of Chinese Americans who want to work on issues that are going on in China, and they want to advocate on the Uyghurs or on human rights issues. And that's a totally different situation now, where when you have those donor names exposed, you're actually exposing them to real danger, not to mention, family members that are abroad in China. And so I think it needs to be taken seriously beyond just the political theater of saying, let's get all the dark money out of politics.
Yeah, exactly. And once again, a hurrah to the wisdom of the founders and the First Amendment for recognizing that point. Okay, let's turn to a couple of listener letters. Matthew writes in reference to our student loan forgiveness discussion of last week, and he says, first, you said that finding a party with standing to legally challenge the president's loan forgiveness by fiat would be difficult, and posited that maybe this would have to be a loan company which could demonstrate financial harm. But on Tuesday's podcast, you mentioned some liberal senators campaigning to include additional parental loans in the program. If a parent not currently included in the campaign brought a case and it made it to the Supreme Court, would that open the way for the court to nullify the whole program? Alicia, what's your thoughts?
So I don't think a parent in this case would seem to have legal standing. So the Article 3 federal courts may only hear actual cases and controversies. So under that doctrine is that there's legal standing doctrine. A plaintiff actually would have to show concrete and particularized injury. In this case, it could be unfair to parents who aren't getting loan forgiveness, but it's not clear to me that it actually injures them in any particular way. And so that's the threshold question for any kind of lawsuit here.
Yeah, this is a tricky one. It's tricky more broadly on the entire student loan forgiveness thing, just finding someone who really does demonstrate financial harm. Another letter we've got, this one's from Greg, who writes, with all the denial of reality themes going on these days, I keep waiting for the phrase credibility gap to reappear. It worked so well in the 60s to take down the Johnson administration. Colin, I have to assume this is a reference to Joe Biden saying inflation is no big deal, or Kamala insisting the border is secure. What are your thoughts?
Right. That's so funny. There's so many credibility gaps out there already, right? I mean, which one should we talk about first? I mean, you could have the Biden administration obviously talking about inflation while also offering student loan forgiveness. We could flash back on the, happy talk about the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. I'm sure we could come up with a pretty good laundry list. Maybe we could make actually like a credibility gap hall of fame. We could use the Biden administration. There's, I'm sure, plenty of state examples out there. So credibility gap is a good phrase. I agree. We should revive it.
Yeah, and I think Joe Biden is reviving it all on his own. So there's that. Well, thank you, Alicia. Thank you, Colin. And thank you all for taking some of your precious time, because everyone's time is precious, to listen to us today. Please send further questions and comments to pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back with you on Monday.